Why did the rancher change her life? The question sat in the air like the smell of wet earth after a storm. Simple, stubborn, impossible to ignore. Eliza Moore had come to Dry Creek intending to disappear. She arrived one late afternoon under a sky bruised with rain, a trunk wrapped in oilcloth, a small, steady set of hands that knew how to keep things from spilling. The stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of Nathan Hale's property because Nathan had sent word by the storekeeper. A woman with a reputation for steady hands and sensible bread could be useful. Not a wife, not yet. Just a cook who would keep the house and be out of town by morning. That was the understanding she had thought she would keep. But the world does not always allow tidy departures. The road to the ranch was slick with mud. She carried Lucy, 6 years old and lighter than the trunk, because the child had been swept in from the house during the storm and had refused to walk. A wind gusted, and a tree limb cracked somewhere far off. Eliza's boots sank into the squelch of the roadway. Her apron got dirty. Her palms, already calloused from years of work and hiding, cooled in the rain. She had learned long ago to keep her hands visible, useful, kneading dough, mending a shirt, making a biscuit. Hands told a story she was not yet ready to tell in words. She knelt on the muddy shoulder and gathered Lucy close when the child's breath came thin and ragged. The girl's hair was a tangle of straw and wet curls, and a smear of blood darkened the hem of her dress where a small knee had been scraped. Eliza's first instinct was to fold the girl into her apron and whisper something ordinary. "Don't move, I'm right here," because ordinary words could make the world feel less likely to break. Hands became medicine. She pressed a clean cloth to Lucy's scrape, dug into her trunk for the small sewing kit Nathan had promised would be left on his porch if she took the job, and tied the bandage with a practiced knot. Lucy, eyes wide and suspicious at first, grew still. The scrape would not be the sort of thing to send a child screaming into the night. It would be a thing that would heal under steady care. That was enough to begin trust. Nathan Hale watched from the porch as she worked. He had noticed the way she did not ask for sympathy, the careful economy of her movements. Nathan was the sort of man the country breeds, practical, silent by habit, a man who measured people by what they did rather than what they said. He had been a widower, a rancher who preferred the company of animals and weather to the chatter of town. Still, he had not been unobservant of the ruin that lingering suspicion can do to a person. He had seen it in the way his horses would shy at new riders, in the way the riverbank receded after a flood. He had seen it once in Portland, a long while back, when a woman with a famous hand at mending fell under a cloud and people closed the doors of their houses.
"Bring her in," he said finally, voice flat as the boards of the porch. "You sure, Mr. Hale?" called Collins, one of the hands, from beyond the corral. His question held the soft edge of curiosity and the harder one of rumor. Dry Creek was not as wide with strangers as the mapmakers liked to pretend. Nathan did not answer aloud. He stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the soft bank, and helped Eliza up. His palm met the back of her arm in a way that was steadying but not intimate, just enough to say, "You will not fall on my land." That small physical claim would mean more later than either of them could foresee. Inside the house, the smell of dried beef and wood smoke wrapped the kitchen in a familiar warmth. Eliza set Lucy on a chair and began to work the flour and lard as if memory alone could make the dough rise. Her movements were quick and sure: measure, pinch, fold. Habits of someone who had kept a kitchen running by her wits and speed. The first biscuits she baked were flat, as much from nerves as from the oven temperature, but Lucy gobbled them as if they were the finest thing in the world. Nathan watched Lucy's cheeks balloon with the buttery crumbs and felt something softening where the winter had been. Lucy, for her part, was cautious. The little girl had been raised to measure persons by the shape of their laughter and the steadiness of their hands. Her mother's laugh had been a thing of memory. Nathan's hands had been always busy. With Eliza, she noticed tiny differences. The way Eliza hummed under her breath, the way she braided tobacco and bound it into neat coils that never unraveled, the way she would tuck a scrap of cloth in her pocket and later use it to patch a sock without fuss. Lucy liked that because it made sense to her. People who put things right were good people. Eliza, for her part, began to notice the small domestic rituals that held the house together. The morning light would find her up before the cows, waking the oven with a match and the thought of bread. She swept the kitchen floor in arcs that cleared more than dust. She cleaned the lard lamp and set the table as if offering a picture of order to a house that had not had one for some time. Those acts, repetitive and humble, began to stitch her to the place. Where she had arrived intending to vanish, she found the rhythm of being needed providing a different kind of anonymity, one without shame if she allowed it. The town was not kind to secrets, though it took its time turning them into gossip. Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to take private income in the currency of other people's stories, noticed the new cook at the Hale place. She noticed because she noticed everything: the way the bell at the general store rang, the way the postman walked by, the way the church pews emptied or filled.
Mrs. Patterson's fingers trailed over packages in the store the way a judge might over a court docket. She made connections the way a spider makes a web. By the third day, a comment slipped in at the general store. Just a whisper at first. No accusation yet. A question like a hand slid between curtains. Isn't she the one from Boston? Eliza had been accused once, years before, in a city that still clung to the idea of being too proper to allow scandal to touch its cobblestones. The facts of that time had been a ledge she fell from, and, though she had been acquitted, the fall had left scratches. She never spoke of it at length. She did not want people to feel they had a right to pry. In Dry Creek, she had hoped the past would be a thin thing, something that would bend away under the weight of oven steam and laundry hung to dry. But gossip, once it finds a thread, will pull until the whole sweater comes loose. Nathan heard the whisper no different than any other man hearing the weather, an inevitable thing. He was not the sort to shout back, but he watched instead. He watched the way the men in the stable tilted their heads when she passed, the way Mrs. Patterson lingered at the edge of the church garden, as if hoping someone would offer ammunition for conversation. He watched how Eliza never met those looks with accusation. She met them with an economy of politeness and the workmanlike focus of one who had survived worse by being useful. That steadiness, more than any explanation she might give, made him want to stand between the woman and whatever slander would come. "You'll not go looking for trouble," he told her once, over coffee, coarse and black. It was not an order. It was a simple setting of boundaries, as a man might set a fence. "There's town. They have long tongues." Eliza only shrugged. "I didn't come for trouble," she said, hands around the mug. "I came for a place to cook and a bed that locks." Nathan heard something else in the words, an admission and a promise. There was a quality to her bluntness that drew people in rather than pushing them away. She did not conceal when she meant to leave or stay. She would say what she felt she could afford to say, and leave the rest to the work. Their days fell into pattern. Mornings were flour and the clatter of dishes. Afternoons were the small repair work of a ranch, mending a boot, nursing a lame foal, bandaging a working hand. Evening meant a kettle on the stove, and a narrow moment of talk before the lights sank and they retreated to their corners of the house. Eliza taught Lucy to stretch dough and press the edges just so for a pie. Lucy taught Eliza how to braid ribbon into pigtails that held even when the child wrestled the oxen, when she was allowed to come near them. Nathan would sometimes stand in the doorway, hiding his face in shadow, watching the two of them. He could not help himself. It was as if he were seeing the house as it might be, no longer a place of sleep and day labor, but as a center where people might gather and warm. He surprised himself by thinking of the word he had not let himself say aloud in 5 years.
One morning, a snake slithered up from where the grass thinned near the gate. Collins called it out with the pragmatic calm of someone accustomed to livestock and vermin. Lucy saw it first, a quick flash of dark scaling under the fence. The child froze, one biscuit halfway to her mouth. The snake's head rose, curious and not yet hostile. Eliza moved before thought did. She picked up a broom and, with the kind of steady hand that comes from keeping kitchens and babies safe, she sent the animal on its way with a measured sweep. It was not heroics, just competence, but to Nathan's eyes it read like courage. He did not applaud. He simply handed her the kettle with an unspoken thanks. Small crises stacked like pebbles until one of them rolled into something louder. There was a storm late in the month that came out of the north with a suddenness Dry Creek had not seen in some seasons. The rain came down in slabs. The river swelled. The wind made the porches creak and groan. Nathan and the hands worked in the night. The horses needed to be sheltered, gates needed to be posted against floating debris, and a hand had broken a wrist while trying to secure the feed. The hurt man was driven in on a cart into town for the doctor, leaving the ranch brittle with urgency and the knowledge that their small community could be undone by a single bad night. Lucy, who had always been brave and brittle in equal measure, was the one who pushed through the clamor to the kitchen. She wanted soup. She wanted the thing that always made the house less like a storm, broth, bread, and the rhythm of a spoon. Eliza dished out bowls, the steam fogging the windows, and kept one for herself. She sat opposite Nathan at the long table, he who had been long practiced in keeping his face impassive, and watched him watch Lucy. During a lull, a small accident, Lucy, bringing the kettle from the counter, caught her foot on the rung of a chair and went down. The fall was sudden, the sound sharp in the small room. She had a cut on her wrist where a nail had left a shallow tear. Not severe, but the sort that mattered much more to a child than to anyone else. Eliza's hand closed over the wound, steady and sure, and her fingers moved in ways that made the child stop squalling. Lucy turned her head and looked at Eliza with the blunt, all-at-once honesty of a child. Gratitude, fear, and a question. The question was not for the adults. It was for herself. Where would she put this safety when the storm left? Later, when the storm had passed and the house settled into a tired hush, Lucy wandered to the hearth and sat on the floor with a ragged doll. She watched Eliza knead dough by the lamplight, the woman's hands smoothing lumps and folding the bread in on itself. The lamplight traced calluses and tiny scars, the language of a life lived with work and restraint. "I don't like storm days," Lucy said suddenly, without looking up. Her voice was small and fierce at once. Eliza kept kneading.
"Most folks don't." Her voice had the flatness of someone who had watched many storms from behind a window. "They make it through." Lucy placed the doll in her lap and looked straight at Eliza. "You kept me from hurting my wrist," she said. "You fixed my knee. You make biscuits that taste like my mama. I don't want you to leave." The words landed like a small stone. Eliza paused, flour on her fingers. The sentence itself was dangerous, the admission of wanting something in a place where she had meant only to pass through. She had honed an art in telling the truth that would not give away everything. The danger was not in what Lucy said. Children often spoke with more bravery than sense, but in the truth that hid behind the child's bluntness. Was this a home? Was it possible to take a place and be taken by it? Eliza did not answer with words right away. She folded the dough and wrapped it in cloth, placing it to rise near the warm stove. She turned the kettle down and sat across from the child, matching her smallness with an attempt of softness. "People come and go," she said finally. "I don't stay forever." Lucy's mouth went small, as if measuring a loss. "But you could," she said. "You could stay." The simplicity of the wish arrived like a light. Eliza thought of her own life as a string of departures, leaving a city that had looked at her as if her name was a stain, packing a trunk, doing the math of what you could take when you had to go. She had believed escape was safety, but here, in a kitchen less tidy than the hotels she had once scrubbed, there was something else, the possibility of being chosen. The whisper of want from a 6-year-old child turned into an exposure, not just of what the child felt, but of what the adults had been trying to hide from themselves. If belonging could be chosen, what did that imply? If a child could declare an arbitrariness of affiliation, "I picked you," it turned the whole social calculus on its head. Reputation, that heavy slate that people carried around like an axe over their shoulder, seemed in that one moment less decisive than a child's honest heart. The revelation was not a legal conclusion, it was a moral one. It put pressure on other decisions already simmering, Nathan's private protective gestures, the town's murmurings, and Eliza's own fear that she would always be running. The next day, the town did not stay idle. Rumor moved like a slow burn, and members of the church and some of Mrs. Patterson's coterie began to whisper questions in the general store and at the post office. The question, "Wasn't she the woman from Boston?" mutated into a stare when someone who had once known Eliza's name in the city came through on business. They listened for the answer, for any sign that the man behind the counter would cast her out. Mr. Jenkins, who ran the store and kept his scales true in both coin and cents, saw the division and felt its weight. He had a good mind to give the new cook a tin of sugar under the counter, simple charity that meant more than rumor. Nathan watched the currents that threaded between people. He had a private list of actions that measured a man's character, and within them was one that crystallized in his chest: protect those who work for you and for whom you feel a debt in the world. His debt to Eliza was not romantic at first. It was moral. She had shown skill and steadiness. She had taken Lucy's injury in hand. She had kept the house where his daughter could feel safe. Those facts alone were persuasive. "You don't owe anyone explanations you don't want to give," Nathan said to Eliza one morning as he handed her a wrapped bundle of tobacco. He kept his voice low. "But I'll not have a tongue throw dirt at this door." Eliza folded the tobacco into her apron like a secret. "You don't need to fight for me," she said. The words were a hedge. She had seen people fight on her behalf before, and watched the fight make the whole situation worse. She had been acquitted in a city that loved its scandals. She had learned the danger of public declarations. She did not want to be a cause celeb in a town that blurred lines. Nathan slid an apple across the table, eyes meeting hers. "I'm not asking you to be a cause. I'm asking you to let people see what I see." Let people see. There it was. Nathan's quiet admission that what he had noticed mattered. The statement was a turning of the ground. It began as a protection for a woman under suspicion. In its softest form, it was a claim that the person had value that rumor could not erase. Nathan had not meant to say more, but words have a way of doing their own work. Mrs. Patterson's voice, however, has always been a loud one. She began to pick at the edges of the story, insinuating that a woman with a past could not be trusted with the heart of a child. Her comments carried weight on those who had been burned before by trusting too quickly. For a moment, the house felt the pressure of small-town judgment like rain on a tin roof. It created a rhythm that made the nights longer. The crisis that followed was not monumental in the sense of fate, but it was enough to test the fragile new order. A ranch hand injured his hand in the fence. It was not catastrophic. No one would die. But the wound bled more than it should because the man had been trying to save a colt when the gate snapped. Nathan drove him into town with a stoicism that hid the ache he felt at watching his men hurt. He trusted Eliza to hold the house together in his absence. He trusted her because she had proven herself the week before by saving Lucy's knee and by chasing off a snake without fuss. Those were not small things to a rancher, whose measure of a person was usefulness in crisis. While Nathan was gone, the house needed tending. The kettle boiled. A pall of gossip brushed along the edges of town like dust.
Someone had announced at the store that strangers were never to be trusted. Someone else, unexpectedly, Mrs. Chen, gave a nod toward Eliza when she passed by the market and left a small bag of preserved plums on the counter. Agatha Chen had not been the sort to speak loudly, but when she did, she meant to be heard. Her quiet nod amounted to a vote. Votes have a way of adding up. Lucy's whisper came not as an enormous proclamation, but as a soft, decisive punctuation. It happened in the late afternoon, in the hush after the injured hand had been tended and sent home, after the men had come back with their complaints and praises entwined. Nathan stepped through the kitchen door with mud on his boots and exhaustion stitching the lines of his face. He expected normalcy. He found instead a moment that would later be pointed to as a hinge. Lucy had been sitting on the step between the kitchen and the yard, the light catching her hair like a small halo. She looked at Eliza, then at Nathan, with the splendid honesty only a child possesses, and said very simply, "I picked her. I picked Eliza to be my mama." The sentence held the room like a held breath. Eliza's hands dropped into her lap as if she had been cut off mid-movement. Nathan felt the words land and settle in his chest in a way he had not anticipated. It was not the words themselves that compelled him, but what they revealed. That belonging was not automatic, that it could be conferred with a child's kind of clarity. The whisper made public something that had been building quietly in the kitchen, the truth that Eliza had become family in the ways that matter, through tending, through presence, through the steady care that keeps life from unraveling. For a moment there was only the sound of the clock and the house shifting as some minor thing, an old post, relaxed with temperature. Nathan did not move. He met Eliza's eyes and saw in them a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope, the kind that could be blown out by a careless tongue. He had watched people turn on others for less. He thought of Mrs. Patterson's narrow mouth and imagined the slow drip of gossip becoming an actual flood. But the sting of any tale did not matter as much as the immediate fact. The child had chosen. "Do you mean that?" Nathan asked, his voice stripped of his usual gravel, cleaner than it had been in years. He was asking the child for a thing that was simple and enormous, confirmation. Lucy nodded, as serious as any small jury. Eliza felt the warmth of the choice like sunlight through a drafty window. She had not expected to be chosen. No one who has been pursued by accusation expects the kindness of a choice. The child's whisper exposed the hidden truth about how family can be made, by hands, by biscuits, by 100 small, unremarkable kindnesses. It also exposed something about Nathan. He was the sort of man who could change his life for something that mattered enough. He could, in that unspoken way, claim what he had seen.
The day closed with a hush that felt like the pause before someone takes a breath and decides what to say next. Nathan lingered in the doorway longer than usual. He watched Lucy spooning soup, watched Eliza braid the child's hair, watched the way the light angled across the table and turned the crumbs to gold. He had seen enough here to know that a public stance would have consequences beyond the warm confines of the kitchen. Yet when the whisper happened, he felt an old thing loosen, a hinge in his chest that had been rusted since the first time grief had come to his house. He found himself making quiet plans in his head, small things that would announce support without spectacle, a note of defense to the storekeeper, a refusal when a neighbor came prying. He would not be theatrical. He would be steadfast. But the town's machinery of rumor is patient, and Mrs. Patterson's voice is practiced. The week after Lucy's whisper, the story spread. The Hale house had bet on a woman with a past. For every person who came to the counter with sugar and a nod, there were others who had their doubts. Nathan began to feel the stirrings of outward action, something more than a silent protection at his own table. He did not yet know what that would look like. He only knew that he could not unhear his daughter's simple sentence. That night, Nathan sat on the porch, a blanket around his knees. and watched the stars go on their indifferent business. He rolled the tobacco between his fingers, tracing the seam where the leaf overlapped. It was a small act, but it steadied him. He tried to imagine the future as a man clans fences, useful instead of ornate. He thought of the way Eliza had laid bandage on Lucy's knee without fuss, of how she had sent the snake on its way with a broom and a level gaze. He thought of his own daughter's absolute certainty. Somewhere in that web of small certainties, he found a new certainty, a willingness to mark himself in the world by an action he would take, not in a fit of romance, but out of the plain necessity of protection. Eliza slept in the room at the back of the house that Nathan had set aside for her. A small bed, a trunk, a window that looked out toward the barn. She wrapped her hands around the warmth of being chosen and tried to map what that would mean. It was one thing to be safe inside these walls, and another to be defended in the noisy, small town that sat beyond the fence. She had been acquitted once and had felt the echo of that in the way people had looked away from her in city parlor rooms. She did not want that same feeling to take root here. But the child's whisper had lodged in her like a seed in damp earth. She felt something in her change, not a sudden abandonment of caution, but a softening that made the thought of staying less like a threat and more like an experiment in hope. Outside, the ranch settled into the soft noises of night. One horse shifted, mice scuttled. The wind made the eaves sing.
Eliza thought of the hands that had carried her across half a continent, the hands that had once been ready to hide her if needed, and of Nathan's hand, the first one in a long while that had offered something steadier than suspicion. She realized now that the question, why did the rancher change her life, was more complicated than a single answer. It was not merely that Nathan had seen her competence, though that mattered. It was not merely that a child wanted a mother, though that had tilted things. It was both and more. The whisper had exposed a hidden truth about belonging, and Nathan's willingness to be moved by that truth would mean making his life a different shape. Somewhere downstairs the lamp guttered, throwing long shadows. Eliza traced the path of a scar on her palm she had earned years before, and thought of the small acts that had brought her here: a saved biscuit, a mended sock, a night of shared soup. The storm that had brought her to the house had passed, but storms do not end in a day. They leave roofs to mend and fences to rebuild. She was not naive. She knew the town could still turn. Yet the child's whisper had opened a door she had kept bolted for years. The next morning, Nathan rose with a decision hovering behind his jaw. He would not shout his defense from the ridge. He would not make a parade or a speech. But he would do something that was a public claim by a quieter standard. He would walk into town and speak plainly at the counter of the store where gossip bred. He would tell Mr. Jenkins what he had seen. He would set the measure of his intent by quiet words, not by flourish. The thing he planned was small: an announcement, a deliberate refusal to allow rumor to name his house. He thought of the timbre of his father's jaw, of a man who does what has to be done to keep a place from falling apart. Eliza made biscuits that morning that were lighter than any she had yet baked on Dry Creek. Her hands moved with a steadiness that came from a night of sleep and the sense of being wanted. Lucy sat at the table and traced the patterns in the wood, as if she were reading a map of where she wanted to go. When Nathan slid on his hat and stood by the door, Eliza walked to him and placed both her hands on his arm, an almost ceremonial gesture of solidarity that surprised her. She had spent most of her life avoiding touches that might be claimed as intimacy. This was different. It was not surrender. It was a mutual acceptance of the risk that comes with staying. "Be careful," she said, her voice the barest threat. "I'll speak plain," he answered. His face did not have its usual mask of economy. There was a human pressure there now, a line he could feel. He did not say the word she had avoided for so long, wife, but his eyes were steady. The unspoken promise hung between them like a rope that might yet find them together, or fray under the pull of town gossip.
As Nathan stepped off the porch and toward the road that led to the general store, the house seemed to hold its breath. The moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a small, perilous claim. Eliza watched him go, kneading her hands into the apron, feeling the home she had almost declined to take tremble with possibility. Behind her, Lucy watched with the absolute confidence only a child could have, and the kitchen, with its biscuits and lamp and the lingering smell of bread,
waited for the day to see if the simple truth of a child's whisper would be enough to change a life. Nathan walked the rutted road into town with the weight of a quiet intention in his chest, the sort of thing you make room for by straightening your shoulders and setting your jaw. The general store sat where it always had, its porch sun-bleached and its bell over the door ready to announce comings and goings. He paused at the step long enough to feel the air of the place, heat, dust, the low hum of conversation, and then went in. Inside, the smell of molasses and leather and old paper folded into itself. Mr. Jenkins stood behind the counter, sweeping a pile of oats into a neat scoop, the motion so habitual it might have been carved. Mrs. Patterson was, unsurprisingly, in conversation with a woman about a sugar shortage. Others clustered by the shelves, farmers, a teacher, a minister. Face after face turned as Nathan took off his hat and set it on the peg. He did not make a show of it. He crossed to the counter where Mr. Jenkins met him with an expression that measured each man by the steadiness of his coin and the quiet of his visitors. "Morning, Nathan." The greeting was short and practical. "Morning." Nathan's voice was the kind that kept cattle in line, steady, unadorned. "I came to speak plain." Mr. Jenkins nodded and set down his sweep. The room held its breath in the way small towns do when a subject is about to be touched that might ripple through the river of gossip. Before Nathan could say the words that had been on his mind, a soft voice from the corner offered the town a line to follow. "Is she the one from Boston?" Mrs. Patterson's question hung in the air like a fly caught in a web. It was not an inquiry so much as a volley. Heads turned, someone stifled a cough. Nathan felt the room lean, and felt too the weight of all the silent measurements people make when deciding whether to be kind. He set his hat on the counter and looked at Mr. Jenkins, then at the group gathered by the sugar. He let his gaze rest on Mrs. Patterson for a moment, on the hard set of her mouth, the way her eyebrows negotiated the world, and then set down what he had come to say. "Mrs. Patterson," he began, and his voice carried without pride or pleading. "You've been making questions out of things that don't need answers. Eliza Moore is work in my house. She's kept it clean. She mends. She's good with Lucy. That's what matters here."
There was a shift in the room, a small movement as if a curtain had been drawn, and a new light entered. Some faces warmed, others hardened. Mrs. Patterson's mouth pinched. "A woman with a past," she said. "A past that was tried and found not worth damning her for," Nathan cut in, his hand flat on the counter as if bracing the room itself. "I'm not asking you to let the town forget what gossip remembers. I'm asking you to let us live here. Eliza is under my roof. I'll be answerable for what happens in my house." It was not a shout. It was not a flourish. It was a plain, measured thing. The tone of a man setting a line in the dirt and telling others not to cross it. The kind of proclamation a fence makes without drama. Mr. Jenkins straightened, the old belief in fairness showing briefly in his eyes. "You run your place as you see fit, Nathan," he said. "We've all got our own affairs." A few people murmured agreement. Agatha Chen, who had earlier left a small bag of preserves on the counter, met Nathan's look and nodded once, like a quiet alliance. Not everyone approved. A woman near the calendar shook her head minutely and slid toward the door with the practiced speed of one who doesn't want to be part of what she sees as an awkwardness. "You can't just bring in a stranger with that sort of talk, Nathan," Mrs. Patterson persisted. "If there's anything, scandal, people have a right to know." "My daughter has a right to grow up safe inside a house," Nathan said. His voice tightened in the place where grief had once lived. "Eliza's here to cook and to keep this home. If that makes some folks uneasy, I can't pretend it's their business to make my decisions for me." The conversation cooled into a hum of private opinions, rather than community consensus. Nathan left the store and walked back along the road lined with clapboard houses and the odd hitching rail. The world was the same as when he had left it, but the shape of his small life had moved a degree. Something had shifted in the ledger of his days. When he returned to the ranch that afternoon, the house felt like a thing that had been watched, as if the town had peered in through its windows. Eliza was in by the stove, her hands folding pastry with the sort of economy that made him think of men setting tools in a bench. Lucy was perched at the table, whittling wood into some trimmed shape with the patience of a child who had learned to make her own amusements. Nathan did not parade what he had done. He sat at the table and let the silence hold the space between them. Eliza looked up, her face careful and unreadable. "You were gone longer than you said." "I had to speak." He took a piece of bread and broke it with the same careful motion he used on fence posts. "I'll not have tongues running at my door." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and her fingers were warm as they brushed past him.
"Thank you," she said, and there was a softness to it that had nothing theatrical in it, just plain gratitude. Days passed with the subtle shifts of roots seeking new ground. Some neighbors blew cold, others warmed like bread in the oven. Agatha's husband began to trade small tools at the Hale place again. Mr. Jenkins left a note of fresh sugar. But Mrs. Patterson could not let go easily. Her voice moved through other rooms: church, quilting circle, the grocery line, and with it came a delegation she had the skill to marshal. 3 women whose collective disapproval could be worn like a coat, heavy enough to dampen conversation. They came in the late afternoon with measured steps and the certain conviction that a town had a moral economy. They expected Nathan to be the sort of man who would accept their measure. Eliza was at the stove, flour on her cheek. Lucy sat by the window tracing birds in the dust. "Mr. Hale," Mrs. Patterson began before Nathan had taken off his hat, "we've come to discuss, well, the house." Nathan set down his hat and regarded them. There was no theatricality in his movements. There was only the steadiness of someone used to measuring men by how they took care of what mattered. "We have concerns," the eldest woman said, eyes flicking to Eliza and then away as if to practice the look of propriety. "About the company you keep. About Lucy." "Lucy's company is the most important thing in this house," Nathan said. "She's 6. Who watches a child if not the grown folk under the same roof? Eliza is good with Lucy." The women pressed on, their objections lined with the grammar of small-town morality. Mrs. Patterson, who thought herself the town's conscience, made it plain. A single woman with a notorious past living in a widower's home invited questions. The implication was that Nathan ought, at a minimum, to formalize arrangements that would set the town's mind at ease. Nathan listened. He had thought at first he might feel something like annoyance. Instead, he felt something harder and quieter. The conviction that the question was one he would answer on his terms, not theirs. "I won't be bullied into making promises to satisfy gossip," he said. "If I thought Eliza unfit to be about Lucy, I wouldn't have her in this house. If she were in the wrong, she wouldn't be under my roof. The rest is talk." The women had expected some compromise, an engagement, a pledge, a card to pass along to their neighbors. They found none. Nathan's refusal was not rudeness. It was the plain shape of a man unwilling to have his household safety used as a currency. "We just want what's best for the child," one of them insisted, as if the argument itself could substitute for something more concrete. Nathan's eyes met Lucy's across the room. The child was beginning to look less like the framed memory of a past, and more like a presence that demanded attention. "Lucy's best is being kept whole," he said slowly. "Right now, that means Eliza. I won't make marriage a condition for that." It was not an answer they had expected, and it rippled. The delegation left with their skirts smoothing and opinions made firmer. The room felt like it always did after an argument. Dust stirred, lines drawn in unseen places. Mrs. Patterson did not stop there. She moved through other confidences and found willing ears. Some neighbors grumbled that a woman with questions attached should not be allowed to teach Lucy the ways of the kitchen unvetted. Others looked at the practical benefits of having a competent, hands-on worker in the house and thought their objections less important than the need for bread. The town creaked like an old bloom changing pattern, fast in some threads, slow in others. The next blow to either side came as blow was wont to come in such places, quietly and then all at once. A fire started in a hayloft one late afternoon when the barn's old wiring sparked, an anachronism in a place that tended to its own, with a hiss and a quick thatch. One of the younger hands saw the smolder and shouted. The men ran, and in the scramble someone slipped and caught a shoulder badly on a beam. The blaze, fed by dry hay and wind, leapt to a corner, sending smoke into the sky like a white flag. There is a way fire narrows attention to a point where the important things show like bones under skin. Men who in everyday life had been content to do small tasks found each other shoulder to shoulder. Nathan barked orders like a man who had known storms and calved cattle in the dark. Eliza moved through the chaos with the same steady economy as always, handing bread to the men as they worked, setting water and rags where they might be needed. And when a small pocket of embers threatened a stack of feed, she drove a pitchfork toward deed without asking permission. Lucy stood near the fence with her hands pressed together, eyes bright with the terrible excitement of witnessing danger. Nathan saw her, and in a motion that surprised no one who knew his habits, took her from the fence and sat her on his knee at a safe distance.
His fingers smoothed her hair as he watched the men work. The barn fire was put out by the willingness of hands, those of the ranch, and those of neighbors who had come to help. The hurt shoulder needed to be carried to the house to be battened and bound. The man who had hurt himself was the kind of person who swore softly and grimaced less than he should. He knew Eliza by now. He trusted her to do what needed doing. She took the bandage kit from the trunk, irrigated the scrape with a clean cloth and water, and wrapped the man's shoulder with careful effort, her hands steady and practiced. That night, after the men had bedded down in the barn, and the smoke was a memory clinging to the eaves, Nathan and Eliza took turns watching the injured man. He slept in a chair by the stove, his face slack in the merciful way of those who have been exhausted by labor.
Nathan sat on the porch step with a blanket over his knees, the stars wheeling indifferent above him. He had always been good at night watching. Grief had a way of making a man vigilant. "You did well tonight," he told Eliza without looking up. Words in the dark were easier to keep honest. She set down the kettle she tended and leaned against the doorframe. "We all worked," she said, but there was pride in the smallness of it. The pride of someone who had kept a place when needed. Lucy, who could not sleep for the aftershocks of fear, patted out in her nightgown to see who was awake. She climbed onto Nathan's other knee and tucked her small feet into the crook and felt for the warmth that meant safety. She was a small human calculator of danger and comfort, accurate in her summations. "You're not leaving?" she asked in a voice that still carried the bluntness of a child's demand. Nathan looked at her, and the old man who had learned how to be alone after loss felt something in his chest reconfigure. The choice she had made earlier, simple as that whisper, had not only made Eliza's life pliable, it had made him consider the shape of his own. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Eliza, listening at the doorway, felt a small thread of fear loosen. It had not been all peace. There were quiet rivalries that would not be abated by a single night or a single man's resolve. But there were also small moments, someone handing a cup of tea, a pair of hands steadying a broken thing, that formed the scaffolding of a life. She let herself be held by the thought that maybe stability could be built as slowly as a garden's border, with labor and patience. The town, though, did not easily set aside a story that had taken hold. Mrs. Patterson, having found the idea of a woman with a past under the same roof as a widower discomforting, banded together a small group and set their course toward a more forceful approach. They organized a delegation that arrived one morning with the explicit aim to demand either assurances or a marriage. They came with the righteous certainty of people who believed their moral accounting to be universal. The spokesperson, one of the church elders, stepped up with a precise, rehearsed tone. He spoke of propriety. He spoke of community standards. He suggested gently but insistently that examples were important and that the Hale house must set a right one. Nathan listened as if the words were a book being read aloud. He weighed the speaker with the same care he had given other men's words. The difference was that this was not a small conversation in the store. This was a direct appeal aimed at a house that held a child's future. "Marry her," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly to Nathan, as if the problem would simply be tied off like a rope. Nathan met the gaze of the congregation, then looked at Eliza. She stood by the stove, hands folded in front of her like a door closed on the world.
He felt, strangely, as if he had been maneuvered into a corner where the choice the town demanded might be cowardice framed as compromise. "Marriage is not a seal to be pressed on a woman so talk will stop," he said quietly. "It's between two people. If we marry, it will be because we choose it, not because gossip demands it. I can't promise you a show for your comfort." The elder tried to press further. What of Lucy? Should her future be left to chance? Nathan answered by looking at the child, who sat quietly, tracing a figure in the dust. "Lucy's future will be secured by who keeps her safe, loves her, and raises her. I won't let my decisions be dictated by fear." There are decisions that ask less than courage and others that require it. This was the kind of quiet courage that comes when someone decides to stand at the door of their own house and refuse to let the town's mood set the terms of their family's life. Nathan's words were not bluster. They were a line he had drawn between the safety of his daughter and the comfortable moral judgments of others. The delegation left with their heads high and their opinions intact. For many in town, Nathan's stance was admirable. For others, it was stubborn pride. The division made itself quietly apparent in how men exchanged glances in the stable and how women avoided meeting on the street. Time, which smooths some edges, only sharpened others. Eliza felt the town's breath on her as much as she felt Nathan's hand steady on the plow. She had been practiced in keeping her emotions small and contained. Being at the center of a moral debate in a place not her home forced her to reckon with what staying would mean. Then, in a way that defied anyone's plan, the life they were building was tested not by rumor, but by a real, sharp accident. Lucy, always bustling with the urgent curiosity of children, followed the cattle's shuffled path a little too close to a leaning post. The post was rotten where rain and time had eaten at it. It snapped under the child's weight with a sound that was both small and enormous. She fell, hands flung out to break the sound. For a terrifying second, she lay still. Eliza's whole life condensed into motion. She was across the yard in a step, hands cupping Lucy's face, checking the small bones, the breath, the eyes. Nathan moved like he had learned to do in the first days of being a father, faster than his measured self would like, lifting the child where she lay and carrying her into the kitchen. There were tears, but not a flood of panic. The hurt was surface deep in ways that made the heart race, but with skill and calm could be tended. A scrape on the forehead, a bruise on the hip, things that mattered greatly to a child and less to a doctor who saw more severe cases. Still, the true test was not the injury itself, but the way people who loved her reacted. Eliza laid Lucy on the table with the practiced tenderness of a nurse who both knew and feared the limits of help.
Her hands moved over the child's small frame, treating each spot with clean rags and soothing words. Lucy buried her face into Eliza's shoulder, the way a small creature does when the world has suddenly been rough. Nathan looked at Eliza as if seeing her for the first time in her fullness, not the quiet woman who kept a house, but a person whose hands had steadied his child, and who had, in the crisis, not allowed fear to rule. The realization loosened something in him. The town's questions, the gossip, these seemed petty compared to the immediate fact that the child in his arms trusted this woman, and that trust mattered more than reputation. He moved to take Lucy, and without thinking the gesture through, his hand closed on Eliza's. The touch was an affirmation not of ownership, but of partnership. It was asking whether she would hold the line with him. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met, and under the lamp's yellow light, something unspoken passed between them, the possibility of making a claim together. That night, with the dust of the day still on the boards, and Lucy sleeping hard by the embers of the stove, Nathan sat in the kitchen and looked at Eliza. They had tended the child and patched the world for the moment, but the world outside would not forget. The talk at the store would not vanish. Yet here, in the glow of a house that had been kept by hands both old and new, there was a possibility to make a different sort of announcement, one not made to impress a town, but made to ask permission of a heart. He did not kneel. He did not get down on one knee as the town's stories sometimes imagined men did for a wife. He did something simpler and truer to himself. He reached across the table and took both of Eliza's hands in his own. The gesture told of a man who measured things in practical, physical terms. Hands meeting hands, a covenant in touch. "Eliza," he said, and his voice, when it carried, held the kind of softness he rarely allowed himself. It was not an offer to make a show. "I want you to know you don't have to worry that I'll let talk make choices for my house. I've been thinking about Lucy, about this place. I want to ask you, will you marry me?" The question was not framed like a demand or a salvation. It was an honest, plain asking, carved out of the life they had been making, kneading, mending, standing in the night. There was no rush, no grand spectacle, just a man who had lived alone, and a woman who had learned to hide, and a child who had chosen, and now watched them as if she understood the gravity and the simple truth of promises. Eliza's hands tightened around him for a moment. Her mind ran through maps of all the exits she had kept ready in case the town grew too hot again, all the corners where she had learned to stash belongings for quick departure. Being chosen had been risky once, nearly too costly. She had been acquitted of a charge that nevertheless left its shadow.
She had learned to trust her feet more than people. Yet here was a man asking not to be an emblem of propriety, but to be a companion in the work of raising a child and keeping a home. She thought of Lucy's small face, the way the child's whisper had created a seam through the fabric of her solitude. She thought of Nathan's steady actions, the simple claim in the store, the night watch, the hand on the fence after the barn fire.
He had not always used words. He had used what he knew, the vocabulary of steadiness. "Yes," she said, and the single syllable felt larger than any argument the town could make. It was not a surrender. It was a settling, like a stone finding its place in a foundation. "Yes, Nathan." They did not shout it. They did not ring bells. They folded the moment into the ordinary rhythms of their life. Lucy, who by now was awake and perched on a chair with eyes wide and ripe with the gladness children show when something certain arrives, took both their hands and added her small voice to a vow no church had ordained. "You're my mama," she announced, with the naive conviction children possess when they seal decisions with the authority of small hearts. Word of the proposal moved through town with a new lightness the next day. Some people scowled and said the things they had said before. Others softened, as if having seen a practical solution to an uncomfortable question. Mrs. Patterson, who measured moral terrain with a singular certitude, did not immediately relent, but the tenor of the town shifted in ways that could not be easily reversed. The man who owned the store nodded when Nathan came in. A neighbor returned a favor with a small bouquet of herbs. The wedding, when it came, was not a pageantry. There was no church crowded by gossip and curiosity. Instead, a simple gathering assembled in the Hale barn, the same space that had smoldered weeks before and been made whole by hands that would not let it fall. The ceremony, if it could be called that, consisted of a few words from the minister, who had come because he believed in the sanctity of home rather than the spectacle of judgment. There were a handful of witnesses: Mr. Jenkins with a sack of sugar, Agatha Chen with a quiet smile, Collins and the ranch hands with smudged sleeves. Mrs. Patterson watched from a corner with the manner of a woman who had given her opinion and would not be swayed into theatricality by a private act. Nathan did not make a show. He took Eliza's hand, and in front of the people who had mattered to the survival of his house, offered his pledge. He did not claim her as property. He claimed her as partner. He promised protection that was not possessive, shared labor rather than control, the refusal to let gossip rule their community. It was not the sort of vow that would have pleased a gossip column. It was exactly the kind of vow a kitchen table understands.
They married with a ring fashioned from simple metal, hammered not for brilliance, but for the intention that it represented, a joining of hands and lives. When the minister said the words and stepped back, Lucy clapped with the uncalculated glee only a child can allow. Eliza laughed and then cried, quiet tears that came from the body of a woman who had kept so many exits she had not known how to be held. Afterwards, there was bread, Eliza's bread, and coffee, and a dinner where the town that had been willing to help when the barn burned now came with a different offering: dishes, small gifts, a practical reassurance of community. Some people did not come, and some remained distant. That was the way of towns, but enough had come to make a table. In the weeks that followed, the Hale house settled into its rhythm. The porch saw different lights: children's boots outside, the flicker of lamps, the regular stamp of work on days. Nathan learned to ask for help where pride would have kept him silent. Eliza stopped preparing an exit route every time the bell on the gate rang. She taught Lucy to make biscuits, heavier at first, and then to lighten them, taste being the teacher of patience. Nathan took to watching her hands as she worked, the fold of dough over flour, the calluses on fingers that had learned skill by necessity. The town's gossip softened to a hum in the background, the way wind moves through tall grass. Mrs. Patterson still had her opinions. She sometimes visited the church and found reasons to be near the Hale place in search of a neighbor's news. But even she, over time, began to nod when a child was passed sugar during a picnic, or when a man carried a broken tool from one yard to another. Practical kindness, as it always does on a ranch, tended to outcompete rumor. The hidden truths that Lucy's whisper had exposed settled into the day-to-day life like seeds sprouting into plants. The truth about Eliza, that she was not the sum of one scandal and that the accusation had ended without conviction, remained a fact the town could not rewrite, but it no longer defined her. The truth about belonging, that a family could be chosen, did its work more quietly, in the way neighbors stopped by with mending, and how Mr. Jenkins kept a tin of sugar behind the counter for when Eliza said she'd run low, in the way Agatha's smile arrived with jars of preserved plums. And the truth about Nathan, that he could change his life not from a grand gesture, but from steady acts of protection, was the most important of all. He had not become a different man by whim. He had become a man who allowed his life to change shape,
because he had been persuaded by a child's honest heart and by the consistent proof of Eliza's care. He had chosen, for his daughter, for the house, and quietly for himself. There were still storms. There were still nights when wind banged against the shutters, and a panicked horse needed steady hands.
There were days when the town's whispers came like winter and required more endurance than a single baking or bandage could offer. But the Hale house had become a place where someone could set down a trunk and trust that it would be respected rather than rummaged through. The porch lights were lit more often. Hands found each other in the dark, to mend fences, to deliver milk, to comfort a child. Some months later, Eliza stood at the sink with her hands in soapy water and thought of the night she had knelt in the mud and taken a small, frightened girl into her arms. She thought of the long road that had led her here, the trial, the acquittal, the habit of packing trunks. She had come intending to disappear, and instead, a whisper had made her visible in the best way. Chosen. Nathan entered the kitchen, his boots thudding softly, and stopped for a second to watch the steam rise and catch the light. He picked up a cloth and wiped his hands. When he reached for hers, their fingers closed with the easy certainty of people who had built scaffolding for a life together. In those hands were the histories of both of them, hardships and steadiness, the memory of a loss that had taught him vigilance, and the memory of suspicion that had taught her caution. "You know," he said, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe, "I still like your biscuits the best." She smiled, one small, private curve that belonged only to him, and for a moment all the town's other noises faded into the hum of ordinary things: cows chewing cud, Lucy's laughter in the yard, the kettle beginning to sing on the stove. If this story moves you, if you believe in the power of being chosen and of small acts that protect and build, stay with us, a soft voice might say now, not as a sermon, but as a quiet invitation. The house on the hill continued to hold its light, proof that belonging could be built as surely as a fence, one post at a time. They had become a family not because the town demanded it, but because a child's simple sentence, "I picked her," had revealed a truth worth living by. Nathan had changed his life not for spectacle, but because he understood what it cost to keep a home and what it meant to choose who would fill it. Eliza, for her part, traded the habit of leaving for the labor of staying, and in that barter found a place to lay down her trunk and at last to be home. The porch light burned late into the evening, as if refusing to let anyone forget what had been so quietly decided. Hands, when used to care, built more than fences. They built trust. They made bread rise. They kept children from harm. They were, in the end, the simplest proof that belonging could be chosen and solidified into a life. If this story of second chances and the quiet bravery of ordinary people touched you, consider subscribing to hear more tales where small truths change lives.